It is the 14th of November 1944, somewhere beneath the grey chop of the Kattegat Strait, where the North Sea bleeds into the Baltic. A German Type 7 C U-boat sits motionless at periscope depth. Her crew of 44 men breathe recycled air in near total silence, waiting for their hydrophone operator to confirm that the convoy above has passed. The captain allows himself the smallest measure of relief. They have been running submerged for 11 hours. The men are exhausted, their eyes red-rimmed, their movements slow and careful in the cramped steel corridor that is their world. The hydrophone operator removes his headphones. He reports nothing. What none of them hear, what no instrument aboard can detect, is the quiet presence resting on the seabed 40 metres below them. It has no propeller. It produces no sound. It emits no magnetic signature that the U-boat's degaussing system might deflect. It simply lies there in the silt and the cold, like something geological, like a feature of the ocean floor itself. It weighs roughly as much as a small family saloon car. It has been there for 6 days. The U-boat's captain orders a slow turn to port. The submarine banks gently, and in doing so it pushes a column of water downward, an invisible pressure wave, barely measurable, a fraction of the ambient pressure at that depth. But it is enough. The device on the seabed registers a change of approximately 2.5 millibars. A mechanical switch closes. A current runs through a firing circuit. The detonation happens in a fraction of a second. The U-boat ceases to exist. No wreckage surfaces, no oil slick, no survivors. From the perspective of German Naval Command, a submarine has simply vanished, as several had vanished before it, in waters that Allied aircraft had not swept, that Allied surface vessels had not patrolled in strength, in waters that should have been safe. The Germans called it several things. In their signals traffic, the phrase used most often translates roughly as inexplicable loss. Their engineers had another phrase, passed between them in frustrated whispers, something that acknowledged with creeping unease that the British appeared to have found a way to kill submarines using the ocean itself. This is the story of the Influence mine, specifically the British Mark 14 pressure mine, and how a small team of scientists at a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire engineered a weapon so conceptually alien to conventional naval warfare that it took Germany the better part of 3 years to begin understanding what was killing their submarines. And by then, it was far too late. To understand why the pressure mine represented such a decisive leap forward, you must first understand the catastrophic inadequacy of what came before it. By the autumn of 1939, the primary naval mine in the British arsenal was the contact mine, a device that had changed very little in its fundamental principle since the American Civil War. It was a spherical steel casing, studded with protruding horns, moored to the seabed by a weighted cable, and designed to detonate when a ship's hull made direct physical contact with one of those horns. The concept is simple, the execution is reliable, and in the surface war of the First World War, it had been devastatingly effective. But submarines had changed everything. By 1939, German U-boats were operating at depths that placed them comfortably beneath the moored minefields the Royal Navy was laying in the North Sea and the approaches to the Channel. A contact mine moored at, say, 10 metres, effective against a surface vessel, was entirely useless against a U-boat running at 40 metres. To lay mines at effective submarine depths required longer mooring cables, which introduced new problems. Cables that snap, mines that drift, fields that are unreliable. More critically, a submarine could detect a moored minefield through its own passive sonar, identify the depth of the mines, and simply pass beneath or around them. The very technology that made the submarine lethal had also made it, to a significant extent, immune to the primary British counter. Magnetic mines offered a partial solution. These devices, developed in the 1930s and deployed with devastating early effect against British shipping when Germany used them offensively, detected the distortion in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the mass of steel in a ship's hull. They required no physical contact. They were harder to avoid. But by 1940, both sides had developed degaussing, a process of running electrical current through a ship's hull to neutralise its magnetic signature, and the magnetic mine's effectiveness had been substantially reduced. German U-boats were routinely degaussed before patrols. Their commanders knew to take their submarines through degaussing ranges before entering contested waters. The British needed something that a submarine could not neutralise by any known means, something that responded not to magnetism, not to physical contact, but to a property of the submarine's presence that was entirely unavoidable. They needed a mine that killed you simply because you were there. The Admiralty mining establishment, operating out of a converted country estate called Imber Court in Surrey, as well as facilities at Vernon in Portsmouth, had been grappling with the pressure concept since the late 1930s. The theoretical principle was not new. German engineers had actually developed an early, pressure-sensitive naval mine during the First World War. Though it never reached operational deployment in significant numbers, the British knew this. What they did not yet know was how to make a device that was sensitive enough to detect the subtle pressure signatures of a passing submarine, reliable enough to survive months on the seabed without triggering falsely, and robust enough to actually destroy a submarine when it did fire. The pressure signature of a submarine is, in essence, a consequence of basic physics. A submarine moving through water displaces that water, creating a region of slightly reduced pressure in the water above it and slightly increased pressure in the water beside and below it as the displaced water rushes to fill the void. At the surface, this is visible as the characteristic bow wave, but at depth the effect is subtler. A transient pressure change that radiates outward from the submarine's hull like the whisper of a bell. At 40 metres depth, a submarine the size of a Type 7C, roughly 67 metres in length, displacing approximately 871 tonnes when submerged, produces a pressure change measurable in millibars, a unit of pressure equivalent to the weight of a column of water roughly 1 centimetre tall. To put that in perspective, the pressure change created by a fully laden goods lorry driving over a bridge is roughly 30 times greater than the pressure change a submarine produces 40 metres above a seabed mine. Building a sensor capable of reliably detecting a signal that's subtle amid the ambient noise of tides, wave action, thermal currents and biological activity, without triggering on false signals, was the central engineering challenge. The team at Vernon developed what they called a pressure-sensitive capsule, a sealed, partially evacuated chamber connected to a flexible diaphragm that was exposed to the surrounding water. As ambient water pressure changed, the diaphragm flexed. The flexing moved a contact arm. When the arm moved far enough, when pressure dropped by approximately 2 to 3 millibars, corresponding to the passage of a large submerged vessel, it completed the firing circuit. The elegance of the design was in its passivity. It required no power to listen. It simply waited, mechanically, for the ocean to speak to it. The Mark 14 mine was cylindrical in form, roughly 2.1 metres long and approximately 56 centimetres in diameter, and weighed in the region of 680 kilograms, of which approximately 220 kilograms was amatol explosive, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and TNT that the Royal Navy had been refining for decades. It was designed to be laid from aircraft, specifically from the Handley Page, Halifax and Avro Lancaster bombers of RAF Bomber Command's mine-laying squadrons, which conducted operations under the deliberately uninspiring codename Operation Gardening. The mines were dropped into target waterways at night, from low altitude, on parachutes. The parachute slowed the descent, preventing damage on water entry, and was designed to separate from the mine as it sank. The mine settled to the bottom. It then sat, inert, undetectable, waiting. Production of the Mark 14 took place at Royal Ordnance factories across England, with assembly and fusing conducted at depots in Herefordshire and elsewhere. Exact production figures for the Mark 14 specifically remain partially classified, but estimates drawn from RAF Bomber Command operational records suggest that somewhere in the region of several thousand pressure mines of various marks were laid in European waters between 1940 and 1945. The operational record of British pressure mining is, inevitably, incomplete. Much of what is known comes from post-war analysis of German naval records, combined with RAF Bomber Command's own strike assessments, which were themselves often uncertain. Submarines that simply failed to return could have been lost to any number of causes: aircraft attack, surface vessel depth charges, navigational accident, structural failure under depth charge near miss. Attributing specific losses to specific mines requires evidence that the seabed rarely provides. What is documented is this: German Naval Command's operational logs from late 1942 onward show a pattern of U-boat losses in areas that had been mined by RAF gardening operations, in circumstances that excluded other explanations. The Kattegat and the Belt, the narrow straits connecting the North Sea to the Baltic, through which all U-boats returning to German Baltic ports had to pass, became particularly deadly. These were shallow waters, often no more than 30 or 40 metres deep, which made them ideal for bottom-lying mines. German records document at least 8 submarine losses in these waters between 1943 and 1945 that post-war analysis attributed specifically to pressure mines. Several more remain probable, but unconfirmed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What made the mines psychologically devastating, beyond their physical effect, was their invisibility to countermeasure. German mine-sweeping doctrine in 1942 relied on paravanes, devices towed by surface vessels that cut the mooring cables of contact mines, and on electromagnetic sweeps for magnetic mines. Neither was relevant to a pressure mine sitting on the seabed. The Germans developed a low-pressure sweep, essentially a device towed behind a vessel that attempted to simulate the pressure signature of a submarine. But it proved difficult to calibrate and only partially effective. By the time German engineers had identified the pressure mine as a distinct threat and developed even partially effective countermeasures, the war's balance had shifted decisively. It is worth pausing to consider what Germany achieved in the same field. German naval engineers were not ignorant of the pressure principle. Their own First World War experiments had demonstrated the concept. By 1943, German intelligence had recovered fragments of British pressure mines, and their engineers at the Kriegsmarine's weapons development establishments were studying them closely. The German response was the oyster mine, developed under the designation EMF. Einheitsmine mit Fernzünder, or standardized mine with remote detonator. It was a capable weapon. It was, in some respects, technically comparable to the British Mark XIV, and it was used with some effect in coastal waters and the Mediterranean. But there was a critical asymmetry. Britain was laying pressure mines offensively, deep inside German-controlled waterways, using long-range bombers that could reach the Kattegat, the Kiel Canal approaches, the Danish belts. Germany, by contrast, lacked the strategic bombing capacity to systematically mine British waters from the air in the same way. The Luftwaffe's mine-laying operations were real and caused losses, but they were never sustained at the volume that Bomber Command's gardening operations maintained. Between 1940 and 1945, RAF Bomber Command flew more than 19,000 gardening sorties, laying over 47,000 mines of all types in European waters. The mines of all types sank or damaged more than 1,000 vessels. Pressure mines were among the most effective of those weapons on a per-unit basis. America developed its own pressure mine program in parallel. The Mark 36 destructor, an adapted bomb fitted with a pressure fuse, and used it to devastating effect during Operation Starvation, the mining of Japanese home waters in 1945. The intellectual lineage is not difficult to trace. Allied mine development was a shared endeavour, with British technical data, and captured German mine specimens flowing across the Atlantic throughout the war. Assessing the true impact of the British pressure mine requires a certain discipline of mind. It is tempting, and not entirely wrong, to imagine it as a war-winning weapon. It was not. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided by a complex of factors. Radar, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park, improved depth charges, the closing of the Atlantic air gap, in which mines played a supporting rather than decisive role. No single technology won that battle, but the pressure mine's contribution was real and specific. It imposed costs on the German submarine fleet that went beyond the vessels it destroyed. It complicated the transit of submarines through home waters. It forced German Naval Command to route submarines through increasingly indirect and time-consuming paths to avoid mined waters, exhausting fuel and crew endurance before patrols had even begun. It created a persistent, irreducible psychological burden on U-boat crews. The knowledge that the waters they transited were never truly safe, that the ocean floor might be waiting for them, that no instrument could tell them whether the seabed beneath them was bare silt or a carefully laid trap. The influence mine, of which pressure was one variant, alongside acoustic and magnetic types, went on to shape naval mine doctrine for decades after the war. Modern influence mines are sophisticated digital devices capable of counting vessel passes, distinguishing between ship types by their acoustic or magnetic signatures, and delaying their activation by predetermined periods. The fundamental concept, detecting the unavoidable physical effects of a vessel's presence, is exactly what the engineers at Vernon were working with in 1940. Surviving examples of Second World War British mines can be seen at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport and at the Imperial War Museum. They are quieter objects than you might expect and considerably more domestic-looking, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing about them. Return for a moment to that November night in the Kattegat. Return to the 44 men in the steel tube and to the quiet thing on the seabed that was listening for them in the only way that mattered. Not for sound, not for magnetism, not for the physical touch of hull against horn, but for the simple, unavoidable fact of their weight in the water, for the pressure they could not help but make simply by being present, for the displacement of water that is the irreducible consequence of existing in an ocean. There is a particular kind of genius in the pressure mine's conception, one that is almost philosophical in character. Every other mine of the era attempted to detect something a submarine was doing, moving fast enough to create sound, maintaining enough iron in its hull to distort a magnetic field, coming close enough to make physical contact. The pressure mine detected something the submarine could not stop doing. It detected existence. The act of being there, of having volume and mass, of pushing water aside in order to occupy space. That was the trigger. That was the signal the mine was waiting for. You could degauss a submarine's hull. You could silence its engines and run on batteries. You could creep through a contact minefield at a depth that kept you clear of the moored charges. But you could not stop being there. You could not make yourself weightless in water. The men who built the Mark 14 understood something that their counterparts in the Kriegsmarine took too long to grasp, that the ocean itself was a weapon, if you knew how to make it listen. Between 1940 and 1945, the aircraft of Bomber Command flew out night after night over dark water and planted that weapon in the shipping lanes, the straits, the harbour approaches, the transit channels, the shallow sandy reaches of the Kattegat, and the Belt and the Bay of Biscay. The Germans called the losses inexplicable. Their engineers called the mechanism sorcery. Their submarine commanders called the waters unpredictable, dangerous, cursed. The British, characteristically, called the whole programme gardening. They were, in their understated way, entirely accurate. They were planting things in the ocean. They were waiting for what would grow. They were tending, with extraordinary patience and precision, a crop of pressure and physics and cold mathematics, and the harvest, measured in iron and silence at the bottom of dark northern waters, was considerable. 8 U-boats confirmed. More probable. Hundreds of damaged or disrupted transits. A persistent, unquantifiable burden of fear on every crew that had to pass through waters that British aircraft had overflown in the previous months. A German naval staff that spent the war's final years issuing advisories about water routes they could not adequately sweep, threatening a threat they could not adequately explain, rerouting submarines through longer and safer paths that were themselves, in time, planted too. The Type 7C at the bottom of the Kattegat has been there for 80 years. The mine that found it has long since corroded into the silt. But the principle it embodied, that the ocean itself can be taught to distinguish between the weight of water and the weight of an enemy, did not corrode with it. It is alive in every influence mine laid in every contested waterway in the world today. It lives in the doctrine and the engineering, and the quiet, patient science of making the sea lethal in ways that cannot be swept or counteracted or escaped. The British built a mine that listened for the one thing a submarine could never stop doing. And what it heard, in the cold and the dark, and the pressure of 40 metres of seawater above it, was the sound of the war, slowly, inexorably, turning.